Boy returns from heaven with a terrifying secret about the afterlife. The grief felt like a physical weight in the Harris household, its presence a constant, invisible force that weighed down on everything. Jack and Caroline sat in the dimly lit living room, their eyes red and swollen from the endless nights of crying. Their son Lucas had been gone for 3 months, and every day felt like an eternity. It wasn't supposed to happen. He was only 10, too young for anything like this. But a sudden, aggressive illness had taken him away in the span of a few weeks, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The funeral had been a blur. There had been the usual funeral speeches, the condolences from the community, the hushed whispers about how tragic it all was. But Jack and Caroline couldn't find any comfort in those words. Every gesture, every well-meaning hug, felt like it was piling more weight onto their already broken hearts. They felt as though they had been left behind in a world that continued to move on, while they were stuck in a frozen moment of loss. The house, which used to be filled with the noise of laughter and the soft rustling of toys being played with, now stood in eerie silence. The photographs on the wall, filled with memories of happier days, were now painful reminders of what they had lost. They had no idea how to live in this new world, this world where their son no longer existed. It was the dead of night when it happened. Jack had been asleep on the couch, his head aching from the tears, when he was woken by a sound. It was faint at first, barely a whisper in the dark. But then, there it was again. A soft, almost imperceptible knock at the door. He tried to ignore it, convinced that it was just the house settling. But then the knock came again, louder this time. Groggily, he stumbled to his feet and walked toward the door, his mind clouded with exhaustion. Caroline had already gone to bed, exhausted from the endless days of grieving, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He approached the door and, with a trembling hand, reached for the handle. The moment he opened it, the air in the house shifted. He was hit with a strange coldness, as if the very atmosphere had changed. And there, standing on the doorstep, was a small figure, his son, Lucas. Jack's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat. His mind couldn't process it. His son was standing there, alive. It didn't make sense. He had seen the body, felt the cold hand, and yet here he was, standing in front of him, looking like he had just walked out of the bedroom. "Dad?" Lucas's voice was soft, almost hesitant, but it was unmistakably his. Jack stumbled back, his legs shaking as he tried to grasp the enormity of what was happening. "No. Oh, this can't be real." He reached out, his hands trembling as they hovered over Lucas's face. You're supposed to be dead." Lucas's expression didn't change. He stood there, staring back at Jack with those wide, innocent eyes, as if everything was perfectly normal. "I'm here, Dad," Lucas said, his voice eerily calm. "I'm here." Jack couldn't move. His body was frozen in place, caught between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of terror. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He had buried his son. He had seen the funeral. He had held his son's cold, lifeless body. So how was this happening? "Caroline!" Jack screamed, his voice breaking with fear. "Caroline, wake up. Get in here." Caroline rushed down the hallway, her face pale, still groggy from sleep. "What's wrong? What's happening?" When she saw Lucas standing there, her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened in disbelief. She stumbled backward, shaking her head as if trying to wake herself from a nightmare. No, this isn't real," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Jack, is this really Lucas?" Lucas took a small step forward, and his eyes shifted toward Caroline. "I'm home. I'm here." Caroline collapsed to her knees, her hands shaking as she reached out to touch him, as if fearing that if she didn't, he might disappear. But when her fingers made contact with his skin, there was no doubt in her mind. He was real. He was here. Jack didn't know what to do. His mind was in a fog, too overwhelmed to make sense of the situation. Everything he had known, everything he had believed, was crumbling. He had lost his son. He had grieved. And now, here he was, standing in front of them, alive. But Lucas wasn't the same. Jack could feel it. There was something different about him. His presence, his calmness, it was unsettling. It wasn't the Lucas they had buried. This was something else. Something that had returned from the other side of death. "Lucas, where were you?" Caroline asked, her voice shaky but desperate. "Where did you go? What happened?" Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at the dark sky above, his eyes distant. "I was somewhere," he said softly. "Somewhere I can't really explain. But it's not the same anymore, Mom. I've seen things. Things that will change everything." Jack's chest tightened. The words, the way Lucas said them, they felt wrong. He wasn't just a child who had returned. He was carrying something. Something heavy. Caroline stood up, her face pale as she stared at Lucas, her mind racing. "What do you mean? What things? What happened to you?" Lucas met her gaze, his eyes now clouded with something Jack couldn't name. "I can't stay, Mom. Not for long. But I came back to warn you. There are things that I saw, things I wasn't supposed to see." Jack felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Warn us about what, Lucas? What's happening?" But Lucas just shook his head, his expression softening with sadness. "I don't have much time to explain," he said. "But what you know about the world, about the afterlife, it's all a lie. There's something much worse than you can imagine waiting for all of us." Jack's mind began to spin. He took a step back, his hand pressed against the doorframe for support. "A lie? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" But Lucas didn't answer. Instead, he turned away, his back to his parents, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon beyond their home. "They're coming," he said softly. "And once they do, nothing will ever be the same again." Jack stood frozen, his heart hammering in his chest as Lucas turned his back on him and Caroline. The boy, the son they had buried only days ago, now stood before them, alive, but different. The way he stood there, gazing into the distance, as if his mind were far away, sent a chill coursing through Jack's veins. The weight of what was happening pressed down on him, suffocating him with every passing second. His body felt numb, like his mind was refusing to accept reality. Caroline's breath was shallow, her voice barely a whisper. Please, come back to us?" But Lucas didn't turn around. He didn't move at all. "Lucas!" Jack shouted, his voice raw with panic, but the boy remained motionless, as if he hadn't heard him at all. The house felt colder, the shadows lengthening in the corners of the room. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that Jack's breath came out in visible puffs, the frost creeping up along the windows. He could feel the presence of something beyond the boy, something that had entered their home, an unseen force, like a dark cloud that had settled inside their walls. The clock on the wall ticked louder, the ticking becoming almost deafening, each second stretching on, like an eternity. It was as if the world had slowed down, each passing moment filled with unbearable tension. Then, finally, Lucas spoke again, his voice soft, but it carried an unsettling weight. "They can hear us," Lucas said, his voice far away. "They've always been listening." Caroline stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Who's listening, Lucas? What do you mean? What's happening?" Lucas slowly turned to face them, his expression unreadable. His eyes, once full of innocence, now seemed hollow, distant, as if they had seen things that no child should ever see. The air around him felt heavy, oppressive, like it was thick with something dark. I saw them all. The ones who were waiting. The ones who are in charge." Jack's pulse quickened. The way Lucas spoke was wrong. There was no emotion in his voice, just a cold, eerie calm. It was as if the boy had somehow become a vessel for something else. Something that wasn't human. "Who are they?" Jack asked, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. He needed answers, but every word that came from Lucas's mouth only led to more questions. Lucas's lips curled slightly, the faintest hint of a smile creeping onto his face, but it wasn't the smile of the boy Jack knew. It was something colder, something more unsettling. "They're the ones who govern everything. The afterlife. You can't escape them. They choose who lives and who dies, who gets to stay and who gets erased." He paused, his eyes shifting to something Jack couldn't see. "And now, they've come for me. They've come for all of us." Jack's head swam. "Erased? he repeated, the word barely leaving his lips before it hit him like a wave. It was like a sudden flash of understanding, a realization so terrifying that his heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, erased? He couldn't finish the sentence. It was too much. His son had died, and now he was back, talking about being erased? Caroline moved closer to Lucas, reaching out with trembling hands, her face twisted with desperation. Lucas, please. Tell us what's going on. We're your parents. You're scaring us. Just tell us what happened to you. Lucas's eyes flicked to her, but his face remained stoic, emotionless. I can't. I'm not the same anymore. He swallowed hard, his eyes shifting toward the door. I remember everything now. Everything they did to me. Jack's stomach dropped. He felt a sudden, sickening realization settle into his bones. This wasn't just some dream. This wasn't some fantasy. Lucas wasn't the boy they had known. Whatever had happened to him on the other side, whatever had returned to them, wasn't human. The room seemed to darken further as Lucas spoke again, his voice growing quieter, more distant. They're not just waiting to take us when we die. They can follow us. They can see everything. They're always watching. And I wasn't supposed to come back. Lucas paused, his lips trembling ever so slightly. But they made a mistake. They didn't realize I remembered. I remember everything about the place. Jack could feel the cold creeping into his bones, a dread so thick it was suffocating him. He took a step back, suddenly feeling the urge to run, to escape, but he knew there was nowhere to go. Caroline clutched Lucas's arm desperately. What do you mean, Lucas? What place? What happened to you? The boy's expression darkened, his eyes shifting, as if he was looking beyond them, beyond the walls of the house, into something far more terrifying. The afterlife, he whispered, his voice barely audible. It's not what they tell you. It's not peaceful. It's a lie. They trick you. They make you think you're in heaven, but it's all a test. A test to see how much you can endure. And once you pass, they take you. Forever. Caroline's breath hitched, a choked sob escaping her lips. But Lucas, why are you here? Why did you come back? Lucas hesitated. I came back because I wasn't supposed to remember. But I do. I saw them. I saw the way they keep track of everything. The ones who control it all. They make sure we follow the rules. And if we don't, they erase us. Every memory. Every part of us. Gone. The room was filled with an unbearable silence. Jack's head throbbed. He wanted to shake his son, to wake himself up from whatever nightmare this was. But Lucas's eyes, his eyes, told him that this was real. That it wasn't a dream. Why me? Jack asked, his voice cracking. Why are they doing this? Why are they coming after us? Lucas's face twisted, and for the briefest of moments, Jack saw the flicker of something he recognized. Fear. Real fear. But it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. They never wanted you to know, Lucas said, his voice heavy with regret. They never wanted anyone to find out. But they don't realize, the more you see, the more you remember, the closer they get. At that moment, a cold breeze swept through the house and the door, which had been shut tightly, rattled. The temperature plummeted even further, the chill cutting through their skin like ice. Caroline let out a frightened gasp as the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, as though something unseen was stretching its fingers toward them. Jack's eyes darted toward the door, his heart pounding. It felt like the house was holding its breath, as if someone, was waiting for them. Waiting for Lucas. Waiting for the boy who had come back from the afterlife with a message. A message that was far too dangerous for anyone to hear. And in that moment, Jack realized that whatever had returned with Lucas was not done with them. It was just beginning. The air in the room was thick with fear, a palpable tension that settled like a blanket over everything. Jack felt the weight of Lucas's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. The boy, his son, their son, was standing there, alive, yet so fundamentally different. His eyes, wide and filled with a kind of knowing that Jack couldn't begin to understand, seemed to pierce through everything, as if he could see things that Jack and Caroline could never comprehend. Lucas stood still, unmoving, his gaze distant, as if seeing something far beyond the walls of their home. The shadows in the room felt deeper now, stretching toward him, wrapping around him like an invisible force, drawing him closer to something unseen, something wrong. The cold had grown unbearable, and Jack's breath came out in visible clouds. Caroline's hand, still grasping Lucas's arm, trembled, her knuckles white from the pressure. Jack's voice was barely a whisper, his throat dry. "What happened to you, Lucas?" His heart pounded with a mixture of fear and desperation. "What did you see? Tell us everything." Lucas finally looked at him. His eyes were unnervingly calm, devoid of the fear a child his age should have shown. There was a coldness in them now, a detachment, as if his mind had been pulled into another world entirely. "I told you, Dad," Lucas said softly. His voice was distant, like he was speaking from a place far away. "It's not what you think. What you know about life, about death. It's all a lie. They don't want us to know the truth." Caroline's breath hitched, and she looked at Jack, her face pale, her lips trembling. "The truth? What truth, Lucas? You're scaring us. Please, we need to understand." Lucas took a deep breath, the air around him seemingly thickening. The room felt colder still, like something was pressing against them from all sides. He looked up at the ceiling, his gaze fixed on something invisible to them, before speaking again, his voice heavy with a chilling revelation. "They control everything," Lucas whispered, his words carrying a weight that seemed to make the room feel smaller, tighter. "They control who lives, who dies, and where we go after. But there's more. There's something worse. I saw it." Jack felt his heart skip a beat, and his blood turned cold. "Saw it?" he echoed, his voice trembling. "Saw what, Lucas? What did you see?" Lucas's eyes locked with his, but they weren't the eyes of his son anymore. They were eyes filled with something else. Something darker. Something ancient. "The afterlife is a system," Lucas continued, his voice eerily calm. "They've been keeping us trapped. Souls aren't free. They think we're all just souls. But that's not it. We're being used, manipulated. They feed off us." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. The ground beneath him felt unsteady, like the very foundation of his reality was crumbling. "Used?" Caroline whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you saying, Lucas? What do you mean?" Lucas didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back, his eyes now scanning the room as though something beyond their vision was watching them. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, stretching toward him like living creatures. The temperature in the room had dropped so low that Jack could see his breath fogging in the air, and his skin prickled with the sensation that they were no longer alone. "It's not just the dead, Mom," Lucas continued, his voice strained, as if the weight of the truth was too much for him to bear. "The afterlife isn't where we go to rest. It's a place of power, of control. And the worst part is, they can make us forget. They make us believe that what we're told is true, that we're just dead. But we're not." Jack felt his chest tighten, a sense of overwhelming dread rising up from deep within him. "Who are they, Lucas?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fear. "Who's in control? Who's keeping us trapped?" For the first time, Lucas's expression flickered with something that almost looked like fear. His gaze darted to the corners of the room again, his body stiffening as though he could sense something approaching. Something far worse than the words he had spoken. "I don't know their name," Lucas said, his voice cracking slightly. "But they are the ones who make sure no one escapes. No one gets out. If they know you figured it out, they'll come for you. They'll erase you." Caroline stepped back, shaking her head in disbelief. "Erase us? What do you mean, erase us?" Lucas closed his eyes, his face strained, as though trying to remember something too horrific to recall. "They don't just kill you," he whispered. "They make you disappear. Erase every trace of you. Your memories, your family, everything." Jack's blood ran cold. "But you're here. You came back. But how?" Lucas's eyes snapped open, and for a split second, they were filled with an indescribable sorrow. "I wasn't supposed to come back. I wasn't supposed to remember. But I did. And now they know." A sudden gust of wind howled through the house, slamming the windows shut with a force that made the walls tremble. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as a cold, unnatural wind swept through the living room, the curtains blowing wildly as if a storm were ripping through their home. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow longer, more menacing, and the temperature dropped even further. "Do you see?" Lucas's voice was soft, barely a whisper now. "They're already here." Jack's breath hitched. He turned toward Caroline, who looked just as terrified, her eyes wide with disbelief. It wasn't just that their son had come back from the dead. It wasn't just the things he had said. It was this. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the presence of something dark, something otherworldly, was suffocating them. Jack stumbled backward, his mind racing. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But even as the words left his lips, he knew. He could feel it. He could feel that something was real, and it was standing right there, in their home. The boy who had returned with a message of the afterlife wasn't just a messenger. He was the witness. He was the one who had seen the dark truth of what lay beyond. And whatever had followed him back was now in their house. "I'm sorry, Dad," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's too late." The room grew colder. The shadows twisted and stretched unnaturally. And then a sound. A low, deep hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls, through their very bones. Something was coming. Something was near. Caroline took a step back, her eyes wide with fear. "Jack, we need to leave. We need to get out of here." But Jack couldn't move. He couldn't leave. Not now. The truth had already sunk in. The afterlife's darkest secret had been exposed, and there was no escaping it. No running from it. The sound grew louder, filling the room, and Jack turned to see Lucas standing perfectly still, his face now unreadable, the eerie calmness replaced with something else, acceptance. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice steady. "It's already here. It's not just about what happens when we die. It's about who controls it. And now, they've come for me. For us." And with those words, Jack realized that the nightmare had just begun. The cold wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows as though it were trying to break through the very walls of their home. The shadows that had stretched along the edges of the room seemed to writhe and twist, their shapes distorting in unnatural ways. Jack's heart thudded painfully in his chest, his thoughts a chaotic mess, trying to piece together what was happening, what Lucas had told them, and why it felt like their very reality was beginning to unravel. Caroline reached out, her hand trembling as she grabbed Jack's arm, pulling him toward her. "Jack," she gasped, her voice quivering, "what's happening? This is impossible. None of this makes sense." Jack shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't know, Caroline. I don't know. But Lucas, he's telling the truth. There's something out there. Something that controls everything. And it's come for us." Lucas stood there, his eyes distant, his posture unnervingly rigid. The eerie calmness in his face made Jack's stomach churn. He was no longer the boy they had once known, the playful child who would joke and laugh. This Lucas, the one standing in front of them, was a stranger. His voice, once innocent, was now cold and deliberate, like he had been forever changed by whatever he had seen in the afterlife. "They're already here," Lucas repeated, his voice hollow, detached. "They've followed me back. And now they'll find you. All of you." Jack looked at Caroline, who was clinging to him now, her face a mask of fear. She shook her head in disbelief, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are they, Lucas? Who are they?" But Lucas didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the window, staring out into the dark night. Jack followed his gaze, his eyes searching the empty street outside, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, there was something wrong in the air. It wasn't just the chill that had settled into the room. It wasn't just the shadows that seemed to stretch and move. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house, so forceful that the walls seemed to tremble. Jack spun around, his pulse racing, his mind racing even faster. The house was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be their sanctuary from the world. But now, it felt like a prison, one that was closing in on them from all sides. The windows rattled again, the faint sound of something scraping against the glass sending chills down Jack's spine. The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, darker, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to warp. Something was coming. Something that shouldn't be there. "Do you hear that?" Caroline whispered, her voice strained with fear. Her eyes were wide, scanning the room nervously, but Jack couldn't answer. His ears were filled with the sound of a low hum, something deep and resonant, as though the air itself was vibrating. It felt like the ground beneath their feet was trembling. "It's them," Lucas said softly, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "They found us. They're coming." The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, alive, as if they had a will of their own. Jack's mind reeled. What was happening? What was this thing? These forces? These beings that controlled death, the afterlife, life itself? The air grew colder still, and Jack's breath came out in visible clouds. He looked toward the door, half expecting something, or someone, to burst through it at any moment. But no one entered. There was only the oppressive weight of the silence, broken only by the sound of the low, resonant hum that seemed to fill the entire house. Caroline stepped forward, her body trembling as she pulled Jack's hand in hers. "We have to leave." "No." Her eyes were wide with terror. "We can't stay here, Jack. If they're coming for us, if what Lucas is saying is real, we need to leave." Jack's stomach churned at the thought. His mind screamed at him to run, to escape from whatever was here, whatever was coming. But deep down, he knew it was futile. No matter where they went, no matter how fast they ran, these things, these beings, would find them. They had already found Lucas. They had already broken through to their world. "Lucas, is there any way we can stop them?" Jack asked, his voice hoarse, desperate for an answer, any answer. "Tell me how we can fight them. How do we survive?" Lucas turned to face them slowly, his expression almost unreadable. He stepped forward, his small form oddly composed, as though he had already accepted something that Jack and Caroline couldn't fathom. "You can't fight them. You can only hide. You only have one choice left." Caroline gasped, her hands shaking. "Hide? What do you mean? Where do we hide? How can we hide from something like that?" The shadows in the room seemed to pulse again, more violently now, as if they were reacting to Lucas's words. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the walls, until it was nearly unbearable. Jack's skin crawled. It felt as if the house was no longer theirs, as if the very air was suffocating them, closing in around them like a trap. Lucas's eyes were hard now, his voice growing more serious. "You can't escape them. They won't let you. They're here. They've always been here. And once they find you, they'll take you. They'll erase you. And everything you've ever known will disappear." "Please," Caroline whispered, pulling Jack closer, her hands desperately gripping his arm. "What do we do? How do we stop this? What can we do?" Lucas's gaze hardened, and he looked toward the door, his face pale. "You can't stop it. You just have to survive. Find a way to survive. You won't escape, but you can hold on for a little while longer." A loud crash suddenly echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, too many of them, too heavy, as though something was dragging itself across the ground. And then, in the distance, Jack thought he heard a voice. But it wasn't human. It was something darker, a whisper that seemed to cut through the very fabric of the air. "Dad," Lucas said, his voice breaking slightly, "they're here." Jack turned toward the door, his chest tight with fear. He knew it wasn't just the boy anymore. He knew it wasn't just the strange, cryptic warnings. The entity, the ones, were here, and their presence was undeniable. And as the door creaked open, Jack felt a coldness seep into his very bones. The shadows in the corners of the room began to stretch, reaching toward them like fingers, and the low hum that had filled the house grew louder, more resonant, until it felt as if the walls themselves were closing in. They had entered their home, and there was no way out. Caroline's grip tightened on his arm, her eyes wide with terror. She could feel it too. Whatever was on the other side of that door wasn't just a presence, it was something real, something far more powerful than they could comprehend. From behind them, Lucas stood completely still, his eyes locked on the door, his expression unreadable. "They're coming," he whispered, the words barely a sound. "They found us." Jack's chest tightened as he forced himself to step forward, to face the door, to confront whatever was waiting for them. He didn't want to open it. He didn't want to face whatever nightmare was about to spill into their home, but he knew deep down, that they had no choice. The moment Lucas had returned, the world they had known had stopped being theirs to control. The door swung open completely, and in the dim light of the hallway beyond, they saw it. A figure standing motionless, barely visible, but somehow more present than anything they had ever seen. It was tall, towering even, its features hidden in the dark, but there was something about it, something wrong, that Jack couldn't ignore. Its presence filled the doorway, suffocating the air around them. It wasn't human, not in any sense he could understand. The figure seemed to shimmer, as though it wasn't quite a part of the physical world. It pulsed with an otherworldly energy, like a hole in reality that was pulling the very essence of their home toward it. Caroline gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. What is that?" Jack wanted to speak, but no words came. He felt as though his body had turned to stone, his legs unable to move, his mind unable to process what was happening in front of him. The figure took a step forward, and the temperature in the room dropped so sharply that Jack's teeth began to chatter. The cold wasn't just physical anymore. It was an icy, paralyzing force that seemed to grip his very heart. And then it spoke. "I am the one you were never supposed to see." The voice was low and guttural, sending a tremor through the room. It was neither male nor female, neither human nor something else, just a presence that filled the entire house, drowning out everything else. The words came slowly, deliberately, as if the figure was savoring the fear it was causing. "The veil between life and death is thin, and you have pulled it back. Now there is no escape." Jack's pulse raced. He didn't know what this entity was, but he knew one thing for certain: it wasn't something from this world. It wasn't a mere ghost or spirit. This was something far more dangerous, something that transcended death, something that controlled it. "Dad," Lucas's voice was small, but Jack could hear the tremor in it. He turned to face his son, whose expression had changed. It wasn't just the calm demeanor from earlier. Now, there was a hint of fear in his eyes. His hands clenched at his sides, and he looked at the figure with a sorrowful gaze. "I warned you," Lucas said quietly. "They are coming. They won't let us go now." The figure outside the door did not move, but Jack could feel the weight of its gaze on them, as though it were studying them, probing, weighing their worth, deciding how to deal with them. "We didn't ask for this," Jack shouted, his voice shaking with desperation. "We didn't ask for any of this. What do you want with us?" The figure tilted its head, the faintest movement that was enough to make Jack's heart skip a beat. "Want?" it asked, its voice reverberating in the room. "We do not need to want. We simply take what is ours. You have opened the door, and now you will face the consequences." A loud, otherworldly screech filled the air, a sound so sharp it made Jack feel as if his eardrums were about to burst. He fell to his knees, clutching his head in agony, but the figure did not seem to notice. It stood still, its presence pressing in on them like a vice, suffocating everything. Caroline dropped to the floor beside him, her hands shaking as she reached out for him. "What's happening?" she asked, barely able to speak through the fear choking her voice. "What do we do, Jack? What do we do?" The figure moved again, this time stepping fully into the doorway. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, swirling around it like smoke. "There is no escaping. There never was." The words were final, sealing their fate. Jack could feel the walls closing in, his thoughts a whirlwind of panic and confusion. But Lucas was the only one who remained still. His face was expressionless, his eyes fixed on the figure with an eerie understanding that Jack couldn't comprehend. "You should have listened," Lucas whispered, almost as if speaking to himself. "There's no way out." Jack tried to stand, his legs trembling, but it felt like the floor was shifting beneath him. The air seemed to become denser, colder, as though the weight of something ancient and terrifying was pressing down on their world. He looked back at the figure. Its eyes were glowing now, faint, like burning embers in the dark, and for the first time, Jack understood. The afterlife wasn't just a place of peace and rest. It was a prison, a place of control, and those who ruled it were not benevolent. They had been watching, waiting for someone like Lucas to break through. And now they had come for them all. "You cannot hide from them," the figure continued, its voice now a low, almost melodic hum that seemed to vibrate through Jack's bones. "They will find you, Jack Harris. They will find all of you. The temperature in the room dropped further still. The walls felt like they were closing in. Jack's breath came out in sharp gasps, the air thin, too cold, suffocating him. He turned to Caroline, but her face was pale with fear, her eyes wide, staring at the figure that stood before them. They were trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then, just as suddenly as the figure had appeared, the air shifted. The shadows retreated, and for a moment, everything went still. "This is only the beginning," the figure intoned one last time. "The reckoning has begun. You have no idea what awaits." With that, it vanished into the darkness, its presence gone as quickly as it had come. But Jack knew it was far from over. The worst was yet to come. And there was nowhere to run. Segment 7. The silence that followed the entity's departure was almost worse than its presence. The air, once thick with dread, now felt empty, hollow, as if the walls of the house had become voids, swallowing the very essence of life. Jack stood frozen, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just happened. The figure had disappeared, but its message lingered in the very fabric of the room, its echoes bouncing off the walls like a fading, yet insistent, drumbeat. Caroline didn't move either. She was clutching Lucas, her hands trembling as she pulled him closer to her chest. Her face was pale, but there was a look of absolute terror in her eyes. Fear not just for their immediate safety, but for the unspoken truth that had dawned on them all. They were not just dealing with ghosts or spirits. They were dealing with something much, much worse. Something that had transcended the physical and the spiritual. Something that was in control. "I told you," Lucas whispered, breaking the silence, his voice soft, almost apologetic. "There's nothing we can do." Jack turned toward his son, his chest tight with fear and frustration. "What do you mean, Lucas?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly would break the fragile stillness of the moment. "You've seen it, haven't you? You know what's coming. You've been through it. You have to know how we can fight back, how we can survive this." Lucas shook his head, his expression calm, but his eyes were filled with an unimaginable sadness. "It's not about fighting back anymore, Dad. It's too late for that. We're part of something bigger now. The moment I came back, I became a part of their plan." Jack's breath hitched. "A part of their plan? Plan? What the hell are you talking about?" "I wasn't supposed to remember," Lucas said, his voice trembling for the first time. "But I did. I saw what they want, what they need, and they've been waiting for this. For me to remember." Caroline's grip on Lucas tightened, and her voice quivered with fear. "What do you mean, Lucas? What do they want? What is it that they need?" Lucas turned to face his parents, his eyes meeting theirs with an intensity that chilled them both. "They need a vessel," he said slowly, carefully, as if saying the words aloud made them more real. "A vessel to come back. To step into the physical world. They need someone who's been dead, someone who can move between the worlds, someone like me." Jack's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, someone like you? You're my son. You're not a vessel. You're a child." Lucas looked at him, the faintest flicker of something dark passing across his face. "I wasn't always a child," he whispered. "I was a soul like everyone else. And then I was pulled back. But they didn't expect me to remember. They didn't expect me to know what they're doing." The room felt colder now, the darkness pressing in like a thick fog. It wasn't just the temperature that had dropped, it was something else, something more sinister, something that felt like the very nature of reality was starting to bend and warp around them. Jack's thoughts spun, trying to make sense of what Lucas was saying. It couldn't be true. This couldn't be happening. Could it? The idea of their son being a vessel, a means for these dark entities to cross over, was more terrifying than anything he had ever imagined. "Where are they?" Jack asked, his voice trembling. "Where are they now? The ones who've been watching us? Who've been controlling this whole thing?" "They're here," Lucas said quietly, his voice laced with fear. "They've been here for a long time. But now they're ready." Before Jack could respond, the lights in the room flickered violently, and a crackling, oppressive sound filled the air. The low hum from earlier began to rise again, vibrating through the walls, shaking the very foundations of the house. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch even further, inching toward them like dark tendrils, creeping, twisting in unnatural ways. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. The room seemed to constrict around them, the walls closing in, the darkness growing thicker. The temperature plummeted so quickly that Jack's breath became visible, thick and foggy, swirling in the air. From the shadows emerged a figure. It was tall, towering, its form just barely visible through the darkness. The hum grew louder, more intense, and as the figure stepped fully into the light, Jack's blood froze. It was Lucas. But it wasn't Lucas. This version of his son was different. His eyes were empty, hollow, the pupils wide and black, swallowing the light. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his presence radiated something far darker than any child should possess. It was as if he was being held together by something other than flesh, something far older, far more ancient. Something that wasn't Lucas at all. "Dad," the figure whispered, but the voice that came out of its mouth wasn't Lucas's. It was deeper, colder, more hollow. "I'm sorry, but I'm not who you think I am. They're here now. And there's no going back." Caroline let out a scream, her hands flying to her mouth as she stumbled back, her face a mask of terror. Jack felt paralyzed, his limbs heavy as the figure took a step closer to them, its eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his heart race in fear. "We've been waiting for this moment," the figure, Lucas, said, his voice now full of malice. "You were never supposed to know. But now that you do, there's no escaping what comes next." Jack tried to move, to get closer to Caroline, but his body wouldn't respond. He felt like the air was thickening around him, pressing down on him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His mind raced, but he couldn't find the words to speak. "You're not Lucas," Jack finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. "Something else?" The figure smiled, but it wasn't Lucas's smile. It was a twisted, cruel grin that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "I was Lucas. I was. But now, I am what they need." And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving nothing behind but the thick, oppressive silence. Jack and Caroline stood there, trembling, unable to speak. The only sound was the pounding of their hearts in their ears, the low hum of the afterlife's dark presence still vibrating through the walls, still pressing down on them like a weight too heavy to bear. They were no longer safe. And whatever had followed Lucas back from the afterlife was only just beginning. The room was thick with darkness, suffocating Jack and Caroline with its heavy presence. Every breath they took felt harder, colder. Their son, the boy they had loved and lost, had been consumed by something beyond their understanding. The figure that had once been Lucas was gone, swallowed by the shadows, but the terror it left behind lingered like a weight pressing down on them. Jack's hands trembled as he reached out to Caroline, pulling her close. She was shaking, her body rigid with fear, but she clung to him, her eyes wide with terror. What happened to him?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What is he? What is this?" Jack couldn't answer. His throat was tight, the words stuck somewhere deep inside him. He had seen it with his own eyes, the transformation, the unnatural force that had taken control of his son. He had seen the dark entity take over, and now it was too late to stop it, too late to turn back. The air in the room was thick with the hum of an ancient, malevolent energy, vibrating through the walls like a constant pulse. It felt like the entire house was alive, breathing with them, a dark presence suffocating them from all sides. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, to shift, as though they were growing, expanding, feeding on the fear that had consumed the family. Jack's mind raced. There had to be something, anything, they could do. But what? They couldn't fight this. This wasn't something they could understand or defeat. It was too powerful, too ancient, too beyond them. And then, through the growing terror and the thickening darkness, a voice broke through. It wasn't Lucas's voice. It wasn't even human. It was deeper, colder, and it seemed to echo from all around them. "You can't escape," the voice said, its tone low and rasping, as though it came from the very depths of the earth. "You never could." Jack's heart dropped, and his legs felt weak. The voice wasn't just a sound, it was a force, pushing against him, grinding against his very soul. It was as if it had the power to seep into his mind, to twist his thoughts, to break him. But then, as if in answer to his thoughts, the voice spoke again, more clearly this time, and it sent a chill down his spine. "Your son is mine now. He was chosen. He always was. And so were you." Jack couldn't move. He couldn't think. He just stared at Caroline, who was trembling beside him, her face pale with fear. She was lost just like him. The weight of what they had just heard pressed down on them like a vice. "No," Caroline whispered, shaking her head as if trying to convince herself. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." But the voice that responded was all too real. "It's real. You've seen the truth about the afterlife, about everything. And now it's too late. You will all be erased." The shadows in the room surged, as if to fill the space completely. The walls seemed to close in, the air so thick with the oppressive force that Jack could barely breathe. It was as if the entire universe were collapsing in on itself, and there was nowhere to run. And then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief movement in the dark, but then it became clearer. It was Lucas, his Lucas. But this Lucas wasn't the same. His eyes were black, his skin almost ghostly, pale with a sickly, unnatural sheen. He stood in the doorway, staring at them with that cold, lifeless gaze. And then the boy spoke, his voice a twisted mockery of the one they had once known. "You should have listened," Lucas said, his tone a twisted mockery of innocence. "I warned you. I told you that they would come for us. But you didn't listen. Now, you'll face the consequences." Jack could hardly breathe. The boy who had once been full of life, full of joy and laughter, was now a vessel for something far darker. Something that had taken him. Something that had followed him back from the afterlife. "I don't want to lose you, Lucas," Caroline cried out, her voice breaking with desperation. She fell to her knees in front of him, reaching out to him, as if by sheer will she could bring him back. "Please, please, don't let this happen. Please come back to us." But Lucas didn't move. He didn't even flinch. His cold, dark eyes remained fixed on her, empty and distant. "You've already lost me," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "And you will lose everything. All of you." Suddenly, the air in the room shifted, becoming thick with the same cold force that had surrounded them since the entity's arrival. Jack and Caroline both felt the weight of the darkness pressing down on them, suffocating them, choking them. The walls seemed to pulse with the force, and Jack knew, with a terrible certainty, that they were trapped. There was nowhere to run. There was no escape. "This is where you belong," the voice from the shadows echoed once more. "This is where your story ends." Jack and Caroline stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe. The room was filled with the unbearable hum, the sound of an unseen force closing in around them. There was no hope, no escape, no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The shadows withdrew. The room stopped pulsing. The oppressive cold began to recede, leaving behind only silence. For a moment, Jack dared to believe it was over, that the nightmare had ended. But when he turned to look at Caroline, her face pale with fear, he knew it wasn't. Something had changed. Lucas was gone. But the presence, the force that had invaded their lives, remained. It had claimed what it wanted. And now it was waiting,